As a historical superpower and center of civilization and culture, France is something that speaks to all of our imaginations. Fashion, romance and the Eiffel Tower are all iconic parts of this Western European state. But as a big fan of history, I think the best way to understand something is to look at its past, and that's exactly what we're going to do. I know France, along with most countries, has way too long of a history to put in one video, but I'll try to summarize it as best as I can. In the year 600 BC, Greeks from modern-day Turkey founded the colony of Massalia, which is now the city of Marseille, on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Around the same time, Celtic tribes from Central Europe that would later be known as Gauls started slowly inhabiting the modern-day territory of France, moving further southwest in the centuries following, creating settlements such as Lutetia, which would later become Paris. The Gauls would have many fights with Germanic tribes in the north, Aquitanians in the south, and eventually also the Romans. The Romans, like Romans do, would eventually conquer all of the Gaulish territories and displace Celtic populations to prevent local identities of forming a threat against the Roman authority. This is also around the time when cities like Lugdunum and Narbonensis were founded. This eventually made the former Gaulish territories, which we will be calling Gaul from now on, replace the Celtic languages with Vulgar Latin. Vulgar Latin, if you don't know, was a name for all forms of Latin spoken by the common people within the empire. In Gaul specifically, forms of Vulgar Latin with a lot of influences from the original Celtic languages started to slowly become dominant. This is when the Celtic culture was replaced by Gallo-Roman culture. Eventually, Gaul became pretty well integrated into the empire, with two emperors, Claudius and Caracalla, actually coming from Gaul. But when in the year 260 Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persians, a lot of unrest started to spread across the empire. Gaul, plus modern-day Britain and Iberia, declared their independence as the Gallic Empire. This didn't last long though, and was eventually retaken by the Romans in 274, just 14 years later. Still, this could be seen as the first form of a French state, and this also opened the gates to immigration of the Franks. More about them in a bit. Later in the 4th century, a migration of Celts happened within the empire. Celtic people from Great Britain moved back to mainland Europe after centuries of living on the island. These would later become the Bretons. This is the reason why some people still speak the Celtic languages in the far west of France. Another century later, the Roman Empire slowly started to decline in power. Eventually, the province of Aquitania was given to the Germanic Goths as a reward for helping fight back the Germanic Vandals. Later, cooperation with tribes outside the empire also didn't help remain a stronghold on territory, when the Roman Empire asked the Huns to fight the Burgundians, who were basically pushed into the modern-day area of France, becoming quite dominant in the region. This also led to the Huns becoming stronger and eventually forming an even greater threat to the Roman Empire than the Burgundians did. When the Roman Empire was about to collapse at any moment, most of the territories outside the Italic core were abandoned. The north of Gaul was taken over by the Germanic Franks, the south by Visigoths, and also the Burgundians and many other Celtic tribes and Germanic tribes started to create small kingdoms in Gaul. In 486, Clovis I, a Frank, conquered the north of Gaul, which was one of the few areas still ruled by Roman authorities. This united most of modern-day Belgium and northern France under a Frankish ruler. When Clovis I would eventually adopt Christianity as his religion, his power among the Gallo-Roman people, who were almost entirely Christian, started to grow rapidly. This gave him enough power to eventually defeat the Visigoths and take over control of the southwest of modern-day France. But this kingdom only survived until his death in 511, when it fell apart into 4 kingdoms, spread over his 4 sons, who would later conquer Burgundy too. Keep in mind, these kings didn't have much real power, but were mostly figureheads. In the centuries following, borders between these kingdoms would change a lot, even unifying a couple of times, but breaking up later again. Let's skip forward to the 8th century, when Muslim invaders from North Africa conquered Iberia, and were getting a little bit too close to the Frankish kingdoms for the liking. Several wars in the south were fought, most notably at Toulouse in 721, and at Tours in 732. The latter fought by Charles Martel, earning him much respect and power within the Frankish kingdoms. In 751, his son Pepin the Short would establish the Carolingian dynasty as the ruler of Franks and unify the Frankish kingdoms for the coming decades. And you might have heard of Pepin the Short because he was the father of one of the most infamous rulers in European history, Charlemagne. Charlemagne again reunited the Frankish kingdoms plus Aquitaine, and also conquered Lower Saxony and the Germanic Lombard lands in northern Italy, and incorporated the lands of Bavaria into his kingdom officially. Besides all this, he also pushed the Muslim invaders back as far south as Barcelona and defeated the Avars, a mysterious nomadic tribe from the east. Because of this success and his support to the Catholic Church, he was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope in the year 800, making the Frankish Empire the official successor to the Roman Empire, in the west at least. For a change, his son Louis actually managed to keep the empire united until his death. It was Louis' two sons, Charles the Bald and Louis the German, who split the empire into West and East Francia, with Middle Francia as a buffer state. This buffer state was mostly taken over by East Francia not too much later. In the years following, West Francia fell victim to Vikings, some of which settling in Normandy and becoming known as the Normans. Throughout the entire early Middle Ages from this point onwards, West Francia or France became very decentralized, with some areas such as Normandy, Flanders and Languedoc basically being fully autonomous states within the kingdom. In practice, the dukes and princes had much more power than the king, which especially became a problem when the Normans invaded England and William the Conqueror became king of England, all while still being a subject to the king of France. In 987, Hugh of Capet started the Capetian Dynasty by being elected the new king, but his dynasty now still didn't have much power. In the decades following, France had lost a lot of its territory to the English and it seemed like the end was near, but when King Richard the Lionheart of England died in 1199, the French managed to take back a lot of the lands taken by the English. France slowly started to become more centralized as well, but local rulers still had a lot of power, and in many instances more than the king himself. It was only under King Louis IX that France would become a truly centralized kingdom. Things went okay for France in the years following, all while England still really wanted to take back the lost territories in the south and west of France. Tensions hit a peak in the 14th century when King Charles IV died, and because he had no children, logically, King Edward III of England would be his successor, making him king of both England and France. This was of course unacceptable, and the two countries started a 100 Years War, which was more like multiple conflicts spanning over a period of 125 years. During this war, the French population suffered greatly, not only because of this conflict, but also because it coincidentally happened at the same time as the Black Death. The English seemed to be winning the war, but because of Joan of Arc, someone that probably doesn't need an introduction, the French managed to fight back the English and got back all of France with the exception of Calais and the Channel Islands. The 100 Years War is sometimes seen as the beginning of French nationalism and France as being one of the political and military powers in Europe. After the war, France remained a feudal society, but regions weren't as autonomous as they used to be, and you could speak about a truly unified state of France for the first time. During the Ancien regime, the period of French history between the 100 Years War and the French Revolution, more about that in a bit, France was the second biggest country in Europe, only behind Russia and greatly ahead of England, Spain and the Habsburgs. France became a key conflict zone for the Protestant Reformation. John Calvin, along with the German Martin Luther, one of the most important Protestant reformists, was a Frenchman. As you probably already know, the Protestant Revolution didn't go too well in France, and many were persecuted and fled the country, mostly to the Protestant German states and later also the Dutch Republic. At the same time, the Holy Roman Empire, a collection of German states that for no good reason called itself that way, also struggled with Protestants. Many of the states had big populations converting to Protestantism, and this was against the will of Emperor Ferdinand II, who was for religious uniformity. Although the French crown was against Protestantism, they joined the war on their side because of national interest. This made Catholic forces from the Holy Roman Empire invade France. The war that this started between many European nations would be known as the 30 Years War and became one of the deadliest wars in European history, resulting in 8 million deaths throughout widespread disease, famine and persecution. After the war, which resulted in freedom of religion in the Holy Roman Empire, France started getting interested in colonization, especially the Americas, where the French founded New France, which included the towns of Quebec City and Montreal. In 1643, King Louis XIV came to power, and after the death of his chief minister, he became the true totalitarian ruler of France, placing himself above everyone except for God. His main goal was to eliminate the last small remnants of feudalism and reign over France from Paris all by himself. He would later conquer the Franche-Comté and the Spanish Netherlands, now Belgium. A later peace treaty ended up with him almost completely giving back the lands he conquered. The city of Lille is the only major thing France gained. This peace was fragile though, and later a war broke out between France and the Dutch Republic after France had asked the newly formed Dutch Republic to go to war with Spain again, which they refused. The Dutch Republic was almost overrun, but because of purposely flooding the country to halt the French invaders and help from the English, the French weren't able to. The new peace treaty did give France control over part of the Spanish Netherlands and Franche-Comté. King Louis XIV had also moved the royal court to the Palace of Versailles, where he invited nobility and gave them privileges for good behavior, some as crazy as being allowed to dress him up. All while King Louis XIV was trying to increase his power over the nobility and make his home the center of culture. A lot more wars were fought, and most of them led to nothing, greatly displeasing the French people. This partly led to the Age of Enlightenment. Montesquieu especially proposed the idea of separation of powers, or trias politica, one of the key philosophies behind modern democracy. Many other intellectuals, such as Voltaire, Diderot and Rousseau, spread their thoughts around Europe, putting France on the map as the intellectual heart of Europe, from where the revolution in learning started, for a big part because of the 72,000 article Encyclopedia by Diderot. These ideas about people ruling the country became very popular among the people. We saw the King and Queen of France taxing the people heavily after the financial crisis the country had gotten after the several unrewarding wars they had fought. The unhappiness grew and grew until Paris had seen so many riots that it was basically in total anarchy. The King and Queen had to flee the city. The unhappy citizens of Paris now had the chance to start a revolution. On the 14th of July 1789, angry people stormed the Bastille fortress to capture the weapons and ammunition located inside the building. They ended up freeing the prisoners and killing the governor and several of his guards. Long story short, the king and queen were executed after the war was won by the revolutionaries. In the meantime, they had also invaded the Austrian Netherlands and helped the Dutch revolutionaries create the Batavian Republic, which was basically a puppet state of France. Meanwhile, a certain Corsican general called Napoleon Bonaparte had played a key role in conquering the north of Italy too, which gave him a lot of popularity among the French people. I'm sorry for not going into detail more, but it's a very complicated and messy time and explaining it would require its own video. Anyway, because of the successes he made, Napoleon was titled Emperor in 1804 by the temporary French Senate. The First French Empire was founded. Napoleon conquered lands as far east as Russia and as far west as Spain and was overall very successful and loved. The French Empire was eventually defeated by European powers, with most people seeing the retreat from Russia in the winter of 1812 as a crucial turning point. After he was defeated, the emperor was sent to Elba. This didn't last long though, as he managed to escape and win the hearts of the people again, just to be defeated once more at Waterloo in 1850, after which he was again sent to a remote island, this time in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where he died in 1821. Although this might seem like a very sad end to such a great empire, the French revolutionary spirit never died. The Napoleonic Code made an end to feudalism and recognized the principles of civil liberty, equality before the law, and the secular character of its state. After Napoleon, France became a constitutional monarchy. The new king was the younger brother of King Louis XVI, who was beheaded in the revolution. A time of unrest started between the royalists, who wanted the monarchy before the revolution back, and liberals, who liked the constitutional monarchy and wanted to strengthen democracy even further. The king was replaced for his younger brother, Charles X, and under his rule, Algeria was conquered on the Ottoman Empire. Not long after, a new revolution resulted in a new ruler. King Louis Philippe was put in power by the people after they deposed Charles X. Although there was more power to the common people under him, it was still mostly for the higher class. Eventually, silk workers in Lyon would take over the town hall in a revolt, and riots were plentiful. Because of this, the king started to reign with a stronger and stronger hand, which only led to more riots and demonstrations. Eventually, the king abdicated and the Second French Republic was born in 1848. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, a nephew of the original Napoleon, was elected president of France in the same year. In 1851 he ran out of terms as president, according to the constitution, so he proclaimed himself the president for life through a coup that was eventually accepted by the people through a referendum, of which we still don't really know if it went completely fair. Louis Napoleon was renamed Napoleon III of France and stayed in power from 1852 until 1870, when France became a republic again. This happened during the Franco-Prussian War, a war that started because of the rising tensions between France and Germany. The Germans defeated the French and had Emperor Napoleon III surrender him and his 100,000 troops at Sedan. This led to Leon Gambetta declaring a new republic in France, but in 1871 France was still forced to surrender Paris to the Germans. With the Treaty of Frankfurt, Alsace and Lorraine were annexed by the German Empire and France had lost a major war against the new superpower. The years after the war were a time of mass modernization and industrialization, with railways being built all over France and the country building up its army because of the rising tensions and nationalism in Europe. In 1914 eventually, France declared war on the Central Powers and started mobilizing, thus joining World War I. They were poorly prepared compared to the German army, marching into enemy territory with colorful uniforms forming very easy targets for German artillery. The Germans quickly used the infamous Van Schlieffen Plan to invade France from the north through Belgium, and it seemed like it'd be a replay of the Franco-Prussian War. The Germans were at one point only 65 kilometers away from Paris, and the government had to move to Bordeaux. Allied forces managed to stop the Germans from advancing any further at the Marne River. This was the beginning of the stalemate that was the Western Front. Both sides dug in and trench warfare started. For more information about World War I, I'd recommend checking out the channel The Great War, since I won't be going into too much detail in this video. Germany was eventually defeated and the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Alsace and Lorraine were given back to France, and Germany was seen as the main loser of the war. In total, 1.4 million French died in World War I. In the 1920s, France started constructing the Maginot Line, in case a war against Germany would ever happen again. As we know, it didn't prevent the Germans from invading again, but first, the interbellum. France's economy grew very rapidly during the 1920s due to the money from the United States through the Dawes Plan and money from Germany because of the Treaty of Versailles. Things went really well for the country in those years, just like in many other nations. But then the Great Depression happened. France was actually quite lucky because the crisis affected France later than it did many other countries, starting only in 1931. France also had it pretty good during the Great Depression compared to other countries. Unemployment peaked at only 5% and there was no real banking crisis. But although economically France didn't have it too bad in the 30s, politically they did. Support for communism grew very rapidly in France, with the socialist Léon Blum becoming prime minister in 1936 as the first socialist to ever lead France. It was a huge success though, as they weren't even able to live up to their promises. Meanwhile, also in the 30s, an Austrian Nazi had taken power in Germany, Adolf Hitler. France and England mostly let Germany do what it wanted to do in the late 30s, because they wanted to prevent the conflict and possible war at all costs. When Germany really crossed the line was when they invaded Poland. France and Britain both declared war on Germany and readied their defenses. The Allies expected that Germany would attack France through the Benelux again, so they built defenses there too. Germany attacked and the Allies quickly realized that Germany was unstoppable. New blitzkrieg tactics used tanks as primary weapons for the first time, and France was conquered within months. 400,000 British and French soldiers had to be evacuated at Dunkirk, and on the 14th of June 1940, German soldiers marched into Paris past the Arc de Triomphe. In total, 600,000 French people would die, both soldiers and civilians. On the 6th of June 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy, and on the 15th of August they landed in the Provence. Germany, now losing to both the Soviets in the east and the French, Britons, Americans and Canadians in the west, surrendered Paris on the 25th of August 1944. Not too long after Charles de Gaulle, a resistance hero of France, spoke the famous words:
Paris, Paris outragé, Paris brisé, Paris martyrisé, mais Paris libéré, libéré par lui-même, libéré par son peuple avec le concours.
And that's basically where we are now. Since World War II, France has lost most of its colonies, co-founded the European Union, and grown to be the most visited country and 6th biggest economy in the world. If you enjoyed this extremely long video that could have been even longer if only I went into detail more, then please make sure to share it with your friends that are also interested in history, and please like the video to motivate me to make more of these. Also, please subscribe if you want to stay up to date with my new videos.